What does it have to do with art quilts? Well, one of the things that has to do with art quilts is that this is a field that is only 40 years old, which seems like a long time when we look at our own lifespans. It really isn't a very long time at all. And I think the interesting thing that has happened is that some art quilts are directly tied back to some of the styles or movements of painting or art or sculpture. I would love for it to be a broader sense, but we have to have something here that we can get our mind around. But many art quilts actually reference back to these other forms that, in ways that perhaps the quilters are not even aware that they are referencing. So I thought about all this, and I thought it would be an interesting thing to study art quilts and figure out whether or not there could be categories or classifications that could be used roughly to sort out art quilts, just to see whether or not that could be done. And so I set about this task. And I came up with a list of 6 basic categories into which most art quilts fall. Some of them have been influenced by traditional quilts, which is another subset here, but many of them have been influenced by the painting or the art movements that preceded them. And so this is an example of the first category that I came up with. And before I start in and launch into talking about them, I want to say that there is an overlap. So there are plenty of quilts that could fit in one category or another, but as we go through the categories, maybe you'll see how I thought about it, and you're welcome to disagree or agree with me about this. This is only really proposed as a place to get the conversation started. It's certainly not a definitive analysis of what has happened in the art quilt field for 40 years. So the first category that I came up with is quilts that are inspired by traditional patterns and processes. And there are 3 sub-classifications in this particular category. And the first is the quilts that are mainly pieced. So this is an example of Jan Myers Newberry, you may be familiar with her. And surface design plays a pretty dominant role in this piece, and yet it is essentially a 9-patch. This is a piece by Ingrid Taylor, and it's a riff on an old pattern that was produced using plaids entirely. And so this is another way that art quilts began to evolve, is that the fabrics that were chosen were different from the fabrics that might have been used in traditional patterns. Then there's the whole cloth version that relates back to the traditional pattern. And you may be familiar with Ellen Oppenheimer, who's a fairly successful quilt maker, been around for a pretty long time, probably about my age, who has made her name by screen printing the patterns and then adding the quilting to the screen printed surface. So what you see there has not been pieced in the way that it might have been pieced as a more traditional quilt. It's entirely printed. Other versions include these particular quilts, which are mixed media versions of older patterns. And so this is Amy Orr. This is a log cabin made entirely of twist ties. It was in one of the Quilt Nationals, I think 2007. Another version by John Leffelholtz, and unique to have men in the field, and we'll talk about that again in a little bit. But this is a wedding ring that is made entirely of matchsticks. And in this particular show, quilts that I felt fit this category include quilts by Carol Taylor and Benedict Canale and Melanie Brewer and Liz Koenig. There we have an assortment of things, of quilts that are pieced or appliqued, and yet I think they fall back to this particular, the root of being inspired by tradition. The second category I identified is the innovative pieced quilt that was inspired by traditional piecing. And I think Nancy Crow is probably the most famous and well-known example of an artist who works in this particular style. but it's important to point out that Nancy Crow was inspired by Anna Williams, who was uneducated, I don't mean that in a negative way, but a self-taught quilt maker who had a very improvisational way of working that actually became the inspiration not only for Nancy's work, but for a number of other contemporaries of Nancy's. Judy Rush, who was one of the jurors for your show upstairs, has also worked in this particular style, and this is an example of her work. And in this show, Leslie Bowman Friedlander's beautiful piece is an example of this particular category, I think. Within the category, there are numerous pieces that tread the fine line between being improvisational piecing and pictorial quilts. So this is a piece by Lisa Call that you can see upstairs that has a foot in each of those worlds, as is this beautiful piece by Denise Miller. The third category is narrative or pictorial quilts. And within this category, there are pieces that address socio-political issues, and there are plenty of pieces that are just made either for the joy of making the piece, or because of the color, or for some other reason related to interpreting what could even be a photograph, which is how Lori Lupe, pardon me, I won't get her last name right, Pellish works. In this show, Anne Harwell's piece is a great example of a pictorial quilt, as is this one by Kathy Turin, which is a whole cloth version, may I point out, as opposed to this piece, which is pieced. So within each category, there are these whole cloth versus pieced versions of the style. There's another category, and I think I could do a whole lecture on this and it would really be fun, and it's the self-portrait. And this particular piece is near and dear to my heart because it was done by someone who was originally a student of mine in San Antonio, and it's called Funny Looking Kid. This is Allison Whittemore, and it's actually the same size it is on the screen. And she is now the head of the chemistry department at Our Lady of Incarnate Word College in San Antonio. And she drafted the piece from the photograph by doing the classic thing of, you know, making the grids and then filling in each spot. This was in Quilt National. In this show, Shin Hee Chin, the rolled fabrics assembled on the grid that you'll see upstairs, another really cool example of a self-portrait. The next classification, or I should say this is actually a sub-classification because we're still on figurative work, but this classification is pieces that have a strong graphic arts influence. What I mean by this is several things. It can include text. It could include what looks like clip art in some way. It could include fairly flat or basic primary colors in some way. But these quilts are quilts that you recognize when you see them. And this particular one, and I don't mean by that at all, I don't want to imply that these are dumb or they're simple in any way, which obviously this piece by B. Gilsdorf is not. But they maximize the use of graphic design as it has affected us in the culture in order to make the point. And in this show, we have Sean Quinlan's piece, Kathy Nida, Sherry Cooper, and I find it interesting that this could also be a subset that could be an entire lecture right here, starting with Riva in the 1980s, I think. And Gloria Hansen's piece. I was amazed when I looked at the show upstairs because I didn't get so much of an indication of how these pieces were made when I was sent the slide images. But the impact of the digital printing availability is remarkable to me.